So this is a conversation with Eliot Higgins. He's the founder of Executive Director of Bellingcat, an online open source investigation collective. Bellingcat rose to prominence over its team's investigation of the downing of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 on July of 2014 by Russian-backed separatists in eastern Ukraine, which killed all 298 passengers on board. The evidence, which linked that group to the Russian Army's 53rd Anti-Aircraft Missile Brigade, was later confirmed by the Joint Investigation Team. So I spoke to Eliot about that case and about some of the many investigations that Bellingcat has done in the past 6 years. Among the cases that we mentioned are the Latamne and Ghouta chemical attacks by the Assad regime in Syria in 2017 and 2013 respectively, ISIS's oil refineries and the environmental and humanitarian catastrophes they've caused, the US bombing of Al Jina Mosque in Aleppo in 2017, the Skripal affair in the UK, the Saudi bombings in Yemen, and Europol's #StopChildAbuse campaigns. One thing I wanted to focus on is how Bellingcat's investigative techniques can be used in both human rights and journalism worlds as well. So while this episode features a lot of concrete examples, we also spoke about how anyone listening to this podcast can take part in these investigations, following well-established and always developing tools and techniques. As usual, you can follow the podcast on Twitter @FireTheseTimes, and if you like what I do, please consider supporting this project with only $1 a month on Patreon or on buymeacoffee.com, and you can also do so directly on PayPal if you prefer. Patreon is for monthly, PayPal is for one-offs, and buymeacoffee.com has both options. And if you cannot donate, you can still help by reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for your time.
So I'm Eliot Higgins. I'm the founder of Bellingcat and the executive director.
Awesome, Eliot. Thanks for having this conversation with me. Many people probably already know what Bellingcat is and does, but would you mind explaining for those who don't? And if you can also give like a bit of story of how did it start?
Sure. So Bellingcat is we've struggled to find a good definition, but we call it a kind of online open source investigation collective at the moment. So that basically means we do investigations using material that's found online. That could be anything, a combination of social media posts, satellite imagery, online databases, and kind of anything we can find basically that's online. And it really started in 2014 when I launched this website after I'd been blogging for a couple of years on my blog, the Brown Moses blog, and doing a lot of kind of open source investigation there that over the years built up a kind of following, and then the whole kind of community of online open source investigation grew alongside of that. And by 2014, I wanted to launch a new site which would bring together people who are already kind of doing this online open source investigation themselves and also provide guides and case studies. And that's when I launched Bellingcat. And that was in July 2014. And very rapidly, previously my focus had been Syria. The shooting down of MH17 in eastern Ukraine was our kind of first big investigation as a group.
And that also happened in July 2014.
Yeah, it happened about 3 days after Bellingcat was launched,
Wow.
which has generated a few conspiracy theories.
I mainly hover around the human rights and journalism worlds, and in the past few years, I've seen media outlets and human rights groups basically learning or teaching themselves and teaching others at the same time to use similar tools and techniques that Bellingcat do. How have you found this intersection kind of develop in the past few years now?
It's certainly something that's kind of been accelerating, I would say, in the last probably 3 years, I would say. But, very early on when I started doing this, there wasn't really, as a field of investigation, it didn't really exist in a way. I mean, there'd been always open source investigation, or open source intelligence is probably where it's most used. But, people always use sources, journalists use sources that are out in the public. But the real change was the online component, because what happened with the launch of, smartphones like the iPhone in, 2007, 2008, we started seeing apps being developed that allowed people to share stuff very quickly, lots of material like videos and photographs, social media platforms being developed. So basically more and more ways for people to share information about the lives they're leading and information around them and events that's happening around them. In parallel with that, you also saw platforms like Google Earth, providing satellite imagery to everyone, Google Street View giving reference imagery, Panoramio, Flickr, other ways to find kind of reference imagery of these locations. And those kind of two developed in parallel, and that really led us up to, I think, the events of the Arab Spring, when this kind of open source material started becoming a way to understand what was happening in these countries without actually being there. But that's something that developed, from about 2012 onwards. Well, when people like me and there's this kind of small community of people who kind of got into this kind of open source investigation using this online material, kind of developed, and these were kind of the first people to adopt it, and they came from organisations like Amnesty, Human Rights Watch. Storyful was also very heavily involved early on, and of course myself. And then as kind of, I think the work using this material was shown to actually be solid and interesting, and especially with MH17, which was the first real example of a kind of Bellingcat open source investigation having a criminal investigation that basically confirmed its findings. That, I think, really brought that to attention to a lot more people in the justice and accountability community. So over the past few years, I've been involved, working with groups like the International Criminal Court's Technology Advisory Board to discuss how online open source material and evidence can be used in their court, for example. There's been interest from, for example, the IIIM on Syria that's been set up by the UN General Assembly. They recognise that this open source material will be a big part of their work, and analysing that material will also be a big part of their work. So more and more we're seeing, the real big hitters in the kind of justice and accountability community taking notice of this and recognising it as being valuable. And alongside that, you also have the organisations like the BBC setting up the Africa Eye team, who used a lot of open source investigation and won a lot of awards for that. Also, the New York Times team that's been set up, that doing a lot of really great work, and now partly winning the Pulitzer Prize with the New York Times. So within the kind of very big mainstream media as well, you're also seeing this recognition that doing open source investigation, in the kind of Bellingcat way, I guess you could say, is extremely valuable and, worthwhile to do that.
Just to backtrack a bit, we mentioned MH17, and probably most people already know, but can you give some context of what happened there, and what was Bellingcat's role in exposing what actually happened?
So with MH17, a commercial airliner was shot down over eastern Ukraine on July 17th, 2014. It killed all 298 people on board. And pretty soon, people were blaming Russia for it, or Russian-backed separatists at least, for shooting it down. Russia pushed back, saying no, there was, they had evidence that showed it was, it seemed to be the Ukrainians who did it. So I think for kind of the online open source investigation community, anyone who, whenever you have a story with two sides saying very different things, looking at the open source material is really interesting, because it starts clearing up who's actually telling the truth. And that becomes, that was kind of what we did with Bellingcat. So the first thing we did is we looked at these photographs of a Buk missile launcher that had been photographed supposedly on the day traveling through eastern Ukraine, and we found out where they were taken using a process we call geolocation. We found the approximate time they were taken, and we could show this missile launcher had travelled on the day to this location, which appeared to be the launch site of the missile. We also then identified that this missile launcher in these videos and photographs was identical to a missile launcher that had been seen in Russia a few weeks earlier, and tracked that back to the brigade it came from, the 53rd Air Defence Brigade, using open sources. We were then able to actually identify many members of the 53rd Air Defence Brigade, because we basically explored their social network of soldiers, which was kind of based around the online presence of the 53rd Air Defence Brigade, including their own kind of V-Contactor page for the 53rd Brigade, which all the soldiers were following. And then we kind of identified where it came from, where it was shot down from, all pointed to Russia. And then we started looking at these intercepted calls that had been published by the Joint Investigation Team, which is the official criminal investigation, and the SBU, the Ukrainian Intelligence Services, of Russian separatists, Russian-backed separatists, discussing events related to MH17 and identifying who these people were. And it turned out that some of these people were actually quite senior in the Russian military. One guy was, one of the top people in the FSB, for example. So over time, we've kind of established all this. And because there's been this official criminal investigation that has, once every couple of years giving a press conference to say where they're at with their investigation, every time they've done that, it's basically been just reflecting exactly what we've been writing about at Bellingcat for the previous 2 years. So that kind of really raised our profile, particularly in the Netherlands, of course, because so many of the victims came from that country, but also in Ukraine and also in a more negative way in Russia.
Yeah, I would imagine. Some of the details of that story are quite extraordinary, and I will link to the podcast that Bellingcat did, which is excellent, and a number of other stuff, like the lecture that you gave at SOA Syria Society and the documentary Truth in a Post-Truth World, which is also the title of this episode. I just stole it. There are some of the details, as I said, like, are quite extraordinary. I remember watching actually, and I think it was in a documentary, it was mentioned, or in one of the lectures that you gave, I don't remember, but like some of the information that led you to these soldiers, or to confirm these soldiers, like to confirm their identities, was basically like the groups of mothers of these soldiers posting on, I think, Facebook or on their websites, and then that kind of like, so it was really everyday stuff that ordinary people can do, essentially. Like this is public information. And so this kind of leads me to this question of like, can you give us a sense of how anyone really, including people listening to this, can take part in these kinds of investigative journalism techniques?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of ways to get involved. I mean, as an individual, you can go off and try and do some of the kind of more in-depth investigations, although we generally encourage people to start with something quite simple. Find a video that you're interested in, find out as much as you can about the video, geolocate it, try and figure out what time it was taken. Test your skills, try and develop them. Basically do what I did and start a blog and write about these things. And it doesn't have to be really advanced or complicated investigations. It can be just geolocating a video. But what you're trying to do is, like I was doing when I was first kind of doing stuff, is put out really solid material that you're clear about what you know and what you don't know. Because sometimes you see people doing this work and they kind of just take these leaps of logic, and you want to avoid leaps of logic at all costs. But also, there's different kind of depths of involvement. One of our most successful campaigns is when we've supported the Europol Trace and Object Stop Child Abuse campaign, where Europol was taking objects from child abuse imagery and asking people to identify them. They would cut them out the image and say, do you know what these objects are? We saw they were doing this, and we thought, well, they've got quite a small social media following, and we've got quite a large following, and our following are probably going to be people who will be into this kind of thing. So we started amplifying it and writing articles about it on the website, and because it was such a simple task, that's what made it so good for kind of crowdsourcing the answer of it, sharing it with our community, and that's been very successful. I think there's been at least several children rescued and a couple of the suspects arrested, and that's just through people looking at photographs. I think when it falls apart is when you have a situation like you had with the Boston Marathon bombing and the Reddit community investigating that.
Yeah.
Because there was a large group of people trying to do a very complex investigation, and it developed this kind of groupthink that kind of made people go in the wrong direction. And I think really when you're doing those really intensive investigations, you need a much more smaller, tightly knit group of people with kind of more experience. But, it's kind of like a scale. If you go, with a big audience, then you can do the kind of more simpler stuff that can still have a really positive impact. And what we're trying to do at Bellingcat is we're going to relaunch our website, hopefully in July, although coronavirus is causing some issues with that. And then eventually add to that a volunteer section to the website where we'll be able to kind of direct people into various investigations that they can kind of help out with doing things like geolocation. So it'll give people a chance to contribute, but also kind of learn skills in a kind of controlled environment.
So the two examples you gave are quite interesting. So the one about Europol, if I understand it correctly, is basically these were objects that belonged to the children or were associated to the children that were kidnapped and being trafficked.
Well, what it was, they had abuse photographs, and these were generally images that were kind of, they could do nothing with them. They'd done what they could to figure out what they can, and this was like the last chance. So there are various objects in the background, and sometimes even, the background itself was something they'd be looking at. It'd be like some outdoor scene, and they would ask members of the public if they could identify where they were. So many of these were simply like, this is a bottle of shampoo, and it's like a blurry bottle of shampoo, and people could identify it because even though it's a blurry bottle of shampoo, there's really only so many designs it could possibly be. It could be a supermarket bag from Sweden, or we have someone who is really good at doing these investigations, Carlos, and we've actually just been nominated for we're in the final for European Press Prize for this year. But he's been doing really in-depth investigations into some of these photographs, and one set of photographs he managed to link to a photo studio, I think in Ukraine or Russia, that was previously linked to a lot of child abuse. But he's found stuff that is really like just you would never imagine was possible. I mean, another person who was involved with it, there was a photograph taken from a rooftop somewhere in Asia. It literally could be anywhere in Asia. And he found the precise rooftop it was taken on. And by looking at things like the lack of mobile phone towers, for example, and other changes, we could also date it within a certain date range. So it's a really, I think, good example of how the law enforcement community can actually work with organisations like Bellingcat to have a positive impact on something they're investigating in such a serious case as child abuse.
And in the case of the Boston Marathon bombing, this was the case, as you mentioned, that people online were kind of using the wrong tools or kind of reinforcing each other's perceptions, and they ended up actually like misidentifying people, which led to quite a lot of trouble.
Yeah, I believe one of the persons they identified had been missing and was found dead later.
Oh.
And that obviously was a huge, that was a really good example of exactly why kind of complex investigations done by a large group are a really bad idea, because it does you get all these biases within the group that they don't recognise, and then that causes a lot of trouble. When we're investigating, we run a lot of stuff throughout this kind of Slack channel where there's like 30 of us, and usually if it's a really in-depth investigation, only 2 or 3 people will be working on like the really core of the story, but then you'll have various people, helping with stuff like geolocation or stuff that is a bit broader within that investigation. But if it's just very, I can't think of any good example where lots of people have been involved with a complex investigation and it's actually gone right.
You mentioned before, so I'll just say here that I will try and do a number of episodes where I kind of bring in the Russian world in a sense and the Syrian world, because those are two areas of concern of mine, especially Syria, obviously. And you mentioned that you've been getting quite a lot of these negative attention as well. Like your work and that of Bellingcat obviously has attracted the attention of trolls, conspiracy theorists, but like more importantly for my interest, if you want, the interest probably of the listeners, like even government officials. The Russian government has become particularly obsessed with Bellingcat, but I also saw like the Syrian government personally name you and like mentioned you, like how you live or your lifestyle, or like the fact that you were raising a child on your own at the time, or I don't know what they said, but it was something like very, very personal basically. But and yeah, I think it was like in some UN session or something. So like, sorry, if it's okay for you to kind of tell listeners who don't know the extent to which the Russian government, especially, and others, I guess, have obsessed over Bellingcat, first of all?
Yeah, so it probably really started in early 2015 when we start really making our kind of big making waves with the MH17 investigation. And it started off really more with the kind of Russian media, things like Sputnik and Russia Today being critical of Bellingcat and say, who is this Eliot Higgins and how dare he criticise Russia, that kind of stuff, and trying to make connections between me and the CIA and stuff like that, even
the usual stuff.
Yeah, so there was that, and then over time, kind of Russian government officials started speaking about us. So, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson, she started mentioning Bellingcat and saying we were using fakes. In that incident, we actually emailed the Russian Foreign Ministry and asked them if they could provide evidence of Bellingcat using fakes. Because I kind of assumed at that time is they must have an actual reason for thinking that. They can't just be saying that. And I was very naive at the time. And they basically sent me this 8-page document in Russian that was 4 reasons why the images we were using were fake or stuff like that. But we realised as we were reading through it, they basically just plagiarised it off a Russian live journal. So we basically went back to him and said, please don't plagiarize stuff in the future. We also said all this stuff is actually wrong anyway. And then they emailed me saying, please don't contact us again in the future. But that was really telling for me, because it showed that they're basic, and this is a pattern I've actually seen in the past with Russia, where they basically just take stuff off the internet. So what you found with the August 21st Sarin attack in 2013 is the Russian narrative was basically led by conspiracy theories on the internet they had found. And some of them were quite ridiculous, like saying the videos on YouTube were uploaded the day before, which is just a YouTube kind of date display bug. So you just have these, you have this kind of bizarre feedback from the Russians, and a lot of it is pulling off internet conspiracy theories they've plagiarized, which was bizarre to me. But then what started happening is we discovered, and this was in 2018, I think, that in 2015 and 16, myself and a few of my colleagues had received a lot of emails telling us we needed to change our Google password. And we just ignored them. We thought, this is just some lame phishing attempt to steal our account, probably from some scammer. And it turned out it was part of the same campaign that targeted thousands of people and resulted in the Podesta emails being leaked during the 2016 election, and that was run by Russian intelligence. We also, late last year, on Proton Mail, had a very sophisticated phishing attempt against our accounts, and a small number of accounts, like I think we identified 20 or 30 linked to basically people who are analysts of Russia or doing investigations into Russia, and that was also, from what we can tell, speaking to security experts, that also came from Russia. So there's been that. We've had more and more attacks on us from the Russian media, of course. There's kind of online activity as well. There's loads of people who really hate Bellingcat because they think we're some part of some vast conspiracy. And really what's happened there is kind of the Syria truther community and the MH17 truther community kind of merged once Syria was being bombed by Russia. So that was kind of brought those people together. But there's just for us, there's constant kind of criticism. I mean, we had the Russian ambassador to the UK claim after we did our Skripal investigations that we were part of the UK British deep establishment working against Russia, and we were working for the security services. When he was asked what his evidence was, he said, we just have a feeling. We don't have anything we can show you. So this is just, it's kind of, we get attacked a lot by them, but they end up just making themselves look ridiculous most of the time, and it just gives me, good stories to tell on podcasts.
But has it ever extended to genuine security concerns? Like I mean, Skripal I guess is a a different story, but it is related. I mean, this happened on UK soil, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, Russia Today or Sputnik or both, I don't know how they function sometimes, but they send someone to kind of follow you around for a week, and he came to your door and that kind of stuff.
So yeah, basically what happened there is there was one day a few years ago where I got a message in the morning from this guy called Nimrod Kamer, or Kamir, and he said he was coming down to Leicester to film something for Diwali, and he didn't mention who he was working for, and he said, would it be possible whilst I was in Leicester if I could film you? Now, Diwali is a really big festival in Leicester, but I knew it wasn't for another 3 weeks, so I thought that's really odd, and then I realised that a week or two earlier, he had done a piece on the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights for Russia Today, where he basically went around the town trying to find the head of the Syrian Observatory of Human Rights, who, for legitimate reasons, he has security concerns, doesn't want to be filmed by Russia Today. So I thought, right, this guy's straight away just lying to me about why he's coming, why he wants to interview me. It's going to be for Russia Today. So I said, well, if you want to talk to me, I'm going to be in London next week, so you can talk to me on Monday. And then I got a phone from my accountant's office, and understand that I see my accountant twice a year, so I can file my tax for my company. Saying from the secretary, saying this guy just turned up asking if he could speak to me, like I was going to be there, or the secretary knew who I was, which he had no reason to. Then I got a call from my office saying someone was in the office building asking to speak to me. And then I got a call from my mother saying someone had come and knocked on the door for Russia Today, and she was quite upset about that. And he basically just gone from place to place looking for me, even though he knew I wasn't going to be any of these places. And of course he found some people on the street to interview saying, isn't it weird this person doesn't want to be found? And they would go, yes mate, it's very odd. And then they cut it into a piece saying, why is Eliot Higgins hiding from Russia Today? And I also had another guy. There's this crazy blogger called Graham Phillips who got a bit obsessed with me, who also turned up my office and managed to talk his way in and annoy the staff there. The thing is, I basically use my office as a postal address. I usually just work from home, so it wasn't like he'd find me there anyway. But yeah, I mean, there's that. I mean, I've also, after the Skripal stuff, I had a visit from the police to have a long discussion about my security and just make me aware that I am being, my address is kind of flagged, that if there's ever a call to my address, there's a bit of an explanation to who I am and my background. Because I think if someone turns up and I explain it to them and they're a police officer, they'll probably think I've gone mad. Like, oh, the Russians are after me, you've got to protect me. They'll think I've gone insane. So there's that. And when we travel, it's like, as the staff as well, we're trying to spend more time looking at security concerns as well, because as we become more high profile, obviously do more investigations, especially into these Russian spies, there is a risk. I mean, one thing we try to do is actually stay as high profile as possible, because it makes it, we hope, harder to target us, because there's more of a price to pay than if I stub my toe, people think it's the Russians. So anything worse than that will cause some drama.
Like sort of along the same lines, you mentioned some of these people online. We've both been at the receiving end of some of these same online pro-asset groups, although more recently I think they've gave up on me, but I don't think they've give up on Bellingcat. Much more recently, like I think in the past few months or so, they have sort of been starting to turn against one another, and it was a very weird phenomenon for me to witness. For many of those accounts, I've either blocked them or they've blocked me, but I would see like other people on my timeline sort of comment on it and post screenshots and that kind of thing. So whether I want to or not, I was aware of it. And it was as if they were trying to sort of like outdo one another in trying to prove which one was more ideologically committed, or like it was kind of like a purity contest in some ways, they kind of demonstrating their loyalty to the Assad regime or to the Russian government or to whatever it is. Can you talk a bit about like your impression of these circles and how they end up sort of reinforcing each other's conspiracy theories and so on?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that are kind of influencing this. I think one of it is how online communities work. You can observe is what happens is, if someone has fairly moderate views and they're part of a community and that community accepts those views, they stay with that community. If they believe something that's kind of more extreme, they're often forced out, or they find another community to join that believes exactly what they believe. And once they find a kind of community they're kind of comfortable with, say that Assad doesn't use chemical weapons, that becomes almost like not quite their family, but they draw value as an individual from that community. So they want to demonstrate, that they are, a key member of that community, or they have value in that community, because it increases their own self-worth. So they start doing kind of more and more what we would see as extreme, loud, noisy behavior. You attack people, you write long blog posts, you say this, this thing's, you record videos, and you become a bit of a personality in that community, which kind of then, because you've gone to the kind of extremes to get that recognition, the whole values of this community shift towards that, and people who are uncomfortable with those values split and form their own communities. And this is true not just for Syria, for Russia, political stuff. It's true for Rick and Morty, for example. If this US cartoon Rick and Morty, they had this promotional source that it's mentioned in an episode, and McDonald's had this promotion. So the real kind of annoying Rick and Morty fans would turn up at McDonald's and be literally screaming at the staff, filming it, and then sharing it with the rest of their community, and all the rest of the community would find it hilarious, and that would reinforce that negative behaviour. But you see that with a whole range of different online communities. People, the health community has people who think it's good to drink bleach to cure autism. We have people who think the Earth is flat. And even within that community, there's splits about exactly how the Earth is flat. What I think is happening, though, at the moment with the kind of Syria community, well, basically that community is a combination of people from the kind of Russia truther community and the Syria truther community, who kind of came together over the Russia bombing Syria. And now a lot of them have got into COVID-related conspiracy theories. And that is actually where a lot of these splits are actually starting to form. And it's been quite, from my perspective, very funny to watch, because it's really... these people have terrible opinions, and they believe in conspiracy theories, but now they can't agree on which conspiracy theory is kind of an acceptable level of craziness.
Yeah,
so
which one's too
you'll
much.
see. Yeah, so you're seeing. I was just seeing someone mention today that Eva Bartlett, who was a very big anti-white helmets person, and was heavily promoted by the Russians. They took her to the UN to do a little press conference. She's now seems to be very much into COVID conspiracy theories. She was sharing the Plandemic conspiracy video. Piers Robinson, who was running, who I like to call the Syria propaganda super friends, who's done a lot on chemical weapon attacks, he's also promoting these theories as well. And that seems to be causing a split between that community, and there's this kind of pro-Russian community who don't seem to be, getting into that so much, and they're arguing about it. And I was actually thinking this morning, this is something I should be looking into more, because A, I think it's funny, and B, I think it's an interesting dynamic that's actually happening in the context of how online communities kind of work and stick together and fall apart.
It does reveal a lot. It really, really does reveal a lot. And the really depressing part for me, I mean, I do find it very funny as well, and sometimes it's both funny and depressing at the same time. But the depressing part is that how long it takes for them to sort of eat each other alive. Sorry, but what this kind of attention, the Russian government, these trolls, conspiracy theories, all of those stuff, the sort of things that they always imply, or I mean, in a not very subtle way, sometimes they just say it very directly, is that Bellingcat only investigates crimes of governments that are hostile to the West, so they are anti-Western, which conveniently ignores obviously the crimes committed by Western governments and their allies that Bellingcat also regularly investigates. I mean, the U.S. bombing of a mosque in Aleppo, I think, was one example, and there's a number of ones in Yemen. Can you talk a bit about these cases as well?
Yeah, so we do get loads of people saying, "Well, you're only right about Russia," which is very annoying to our staff members who never write about Russia until on other topics. And we did an investigation into the bombing of Al Jinnah Mosque in Syria, where the US had bombed a mosque, basically. And initially, it was claimed it was Russian or Syrian forces in the initial minutes, but then there was a Hellfire missile remains recovered, and we worked with Human Rights Watch and Forensic Architecture to basically take videos and photographs of the debris of the mosque and try and prove that the building that was destroyed, because it was basically half the building was completely obliterated in this airstrike, prove that half of the building was actually connected to the main prayer hall of this building, which was still intact. And by piecing together, using 3D models, photographs, carefully examining these images, we were able to prove that this was one building, and that the US had, despite their denials, bombed the mosque, and they eventually, admitted they did. Another project we've been doing, basically, we get a lot of interest from just the justice and accountability community about using our work, and because we were set up by basically just myself on my own and a bunch of volunteers eventually, now we're a large organisation with 19 employees, we're able to actually say, okay, let's create a process where we can actually systematically investigate these events and archive this material in a way that can be useful for courts. That means we can, rather than doing what we have to do with MH17 at the moment, which is basically go back and rewrite everything so it can be given to court proceedings, we actually can say, okay, as we do the investigation, we're doing it to a standard where we can just basically hand over the kind of case file to anyone who wants to use it and make those kind of case files public. So we've done a few dozen investigations into airstrikes in Yemen by the Saudi coalition forces, and that's been used in the UK for challenges against arms export agreements to Saudi Arabia, because it shows that the Saudis are definitely targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure, and there's a very high likelihood that British bombers would be part of this. And the UK also supports the Saudis in other ways as well to allow them to do these bombing operations. And that took a huge amount of resources and almost nearly killed Bellingcat, because it was so hard to get it set up and it was really complex. But we did it, and now it's a big fundraising priority for us is to raise money to continue to do this, because it's not so much about Yemen, but about building these tools and processes and methodologies for archiving and investigation, so it can then be used in courts in the future.
You mentioned the child trafficking story, are there other examples of how open source investigation techniques can be used in situations that are not so-called conflict zones? I'm asking this because I have had discussions with a number of people who kind of have this impression that this is only useful in situations where you have like bombings and very dramatic events like that kind of thing. Whereas like investigation techniques can be used in open source investigation techniques can be used in other places as well.
Yeah, it can be used in a very wide, range of topics. I mean, there is a focus on conflict, and it's very useful for investigating conflict events. But anything which needs kind of verifying and fact checking, you can use these techniques. I mean, we've been doing a lot on kind of environmental damage as a result of the conflict in Syria, using kind of remote sensing, using satellite images. And combining that with information from the ground. And these aren't directly related to incidents, but it shows a pattern of behavior. For example, how ISIS basically created a massive need for oil refining, but using very, very crude, polluting methods that roped in basically the civilian population to produce these very makeshift oil refineries. We discovered as part of that as well that a refugee camp had been built on top of one of these sites with all this crude oil just slightly below the surface, and they didn't realise they'd done this because they're basically just trenches filled with crude oil that were covered up. They were looking for a site for a refugee camp. They built it there, not realising what was just under the surface, and then a year or so later the camp flooded, and it brought all the basically crude oil up to the surface where there were kind of children playing in it and stuff like that. And by teaching organisations who are kind of responsible for this that there are ways to kind of use satellite imagery to just check what this place actually looked like before you stick a camp there. It's a small thing, but it's actually really has a lot of impact on the health of those people who are going to be in that camp. You know, those people are going to get sick because they didn't realise that this thing existed, but it's possible to check that kind of stuff. I mean, there's a whole range of issues you can look at using this stuff. It's just that I think because the most high profile stuff in the news is conflict, that tends to get the most attention.
There was this example of someone who, like a family was supposed to be rescued I think it was in the British Virgin Isles or something like that, and there was a hurricane or something along those lines.
Yeah, so what happened there is a BBC journalist shared it was someone we had trained in the past, but he shared a video. It's a very short clip, probably 10 seconds long, and it basically just showed some trees and a view out over the sea with some islands in the distance. And he said a family had gone missing in the British Virgin Islands. They hadn't been in contact with their family in the UK for a few days. They'd just moved there and they didn't actually know the new address of the family. So by using what was visible in that photograph of that video, first of all, using crowdsourcing, I said, can anyone figure out where these islands are? We know they're in the British Virgin Islands. So people went around the edge of the the islands of the British Virgin Islands, looking out to sea on Google using 3D terrain, where you can actually see the shape of these islands that were in the distance, and found a possible location. Then in this video you can see basically very briefly just this wooden handrail and the edge of this roof, and those are like the only clues to which house it's in. I was thinking, where can I find photographs of people's houses? Well, I thought, well, I'll look on Airbnb and estate agents websites, and all the houses in this area were kind of unique designs, and I managed to find a house that had the same handrailing and the same kind of roof structure. And then and it didn't look like the same house. The view was wrong. And then I realised the house next door on satellite imagery had exactly the same layout, and it was the only two houses like that in the entire area. So we called the estate agent who was selling the first house, who had also just sold this other house I was looking at to a UK couple and their kids who had been evacuated a few days earlier, and it was the missing family. But yeah, it can be used to track down missing people. We've done that in the past. Look at another project we did in one of our workshops was looking at the living conditions of migrant workers in the Netherlands, because there was a lot of talk about them being put in really terrible accommodation and being stuck there, and they would share stuff on social media about their living conditions, and no one was really bothering to look at it until outside of their own community, until we kind of looked into it, and it started telling us more about how these things work and what these living conditions were like. So there's a whole range of ways you can use these kind of techniques,
and some of these techniques, I mean, these are available on Bellingcat's website, I think, and there are ways of actually learning them, isn't there?
Yeah, so I mean, we have various guides and case studies on the website, and other organisations like First Draft, for example, they provide case studies. One thing we're going to do along with the volunteer section that we're launching is also create a section for tools. We have a very popular Google document at the moment that lists basically every open source investigation tool we can think of. But there, what we're going to do is actually have all the tools on the website and then link all the tools to any article that we've written that includes it. So if you read an article and think, oh, hey, I could try and do that, there'll be a link to like the tool page, which will explain how the tool's used, where you can download it from if you need to download it, or the website you need to visit, but also linking to other examples on Bellingcat where we've used that same tool, so you can kind of get an idea of how to use it yourself. So we're trying to make the kind of volunteering and educational kind of side of it kind of really integrated with each other.
On the issue of archiving, it's something that's obviously very important, and I know that Bellingcat has worked with groups like Syrian Archive and other websites like that. And can you talk a bit about like the importance? So just a quick context. The archiving in the case of the Lebanese context is something that a bunch of us are quite worried about, because they tend to be like kind of spread out on several websites, on small blogs, on Facebook groups, and that kind of thing, and they tend to be very ephemeral. Like we don't actually know if there's some kind of court case at some point in the near future, whether these people will be able to actually access the same kind of information. So can you talk a bit about how archiving is done, or how it could be done, and how the YouTube case, when YouTube removed a bunch of videos from, say, I think it was related to Syrian opposition channels, like how that was a good example of the importance of archiving?
Yes, so I mean, for us, it's been a really big part of our work as we've been going forwards, because with Syria, as you said, we had an incident back in 2015 or 16, where Google started using an algorithm to detect videos that they thought were basically could violate standards. It was after ISIS had used YouTube to post a bunch of videos, and they'd been cracking down on that. But it resulted in lots of Syrian opposition pages, YouTube channels being taken down. And often, we heard about this, and working with a group called the Syrian Archive, we started asking YouTube what was going on. And it turned out a lot of these were just false positives, because it's very hard to, when you've got like 90,000 videos on a YouTube channel going back 6 years, if you get 3 videos that look like, according to an algorithm, they might be a bit, jihadi-ish, and then some person who's got 5 seconds to check if it's true or not looks at it and decides it is, you're going to lose a lot of channels. And literally we helped get hundreds of thousands of videos restored because of that. So archiving stuff off YouTube and other platforms became a big priority for us. So now we've been working with the Syrian Archive to start archiving this material and basically making sure it's accessible somewhere else that it can be secure. And also, as we're archiving it, doing it to a standard where it can be hashed, it can be shown that the video file hasn't been changed since the archived copy was made. One thing we'd really like to do moving forwards is, as we're developing this process I mentioned earlier with Yemen, is once we kind of package it up and share it with other organisations, is start basically allowing people to have their own archives of material, and then basically an indexing system that allows them to share stuff that's on that archive with a kind of centralized index. So they have full control over what's shared, how much information is shared, but it makes it accessible to groups who might need to use it for other reasons, like research purposes, or like the ICC or IIIM on Syria needing it for evidence, and they can use it knowing that it's kind of been archived in a very particular way. Because otherwise, you can end up with a situation when these bodies ask different organisations for stuff, they've got to send out like 40 different requests written in 40 different ways to 40 different organisations and get 40 different responses. And what I think we need is a system, and this is what we're working towards, where you can basically highlight a part of the country you're interested in, saying, I want everything that was kind of geotagged, or everything linked to this location on this certain date range that are held in multiple archives, and immediately gives you a kind of result set, and you can just say, okay, I now want these videos, and you send a request to everyone with a click of a button, and they can respond automatically, or they can choose what's sent back and stuff like that. So everyone has still full control over the material they've archived, and this could be open source material or material they've collected as part of their work, but it makes it as accessible as possible to those kind of end users who are going to take it and actually turn it into something else.
And like on a final note, what's on the horizon for Bellingcat? Like what can we expect in the next year to whether on Bellingcat's website itself, or like on some of these intersections that we mentioned when it comes to like justice and accountability, or journalism and that kind of thing?
Well, we've been doing a lot of work to professionalised over the last 18 months. I mean, since we did our big Skripal reporting in 2018, we've gone from having, say, about 5 or 6 members of staff to having, I think we're on 18 members of staff. We're a fully registered charity now in the Netherlands, so we get fun things like audits. We've just spent 5 months doing an audit, our first big one, which was really fun. And then so we have a business team, because before it was like literally me doing everything, all the admin work, all the bank recs, all the invoicing, everything. So now I actually have a team doing that. So we now have like a really stable kind of basis for growing as an organisation. So one thing we're focusing on a lot is raising money for this Yemen project that I've been talking about. We're discussing some ideas about with other organisations about having a kind of research and investigation hub based in a country somewhere, which could be quite interesting. We're focusing a lot now actually on producing different kinds of media from what we've been doing. So last year we had the MH17 podcast. Season 2 of that is coming out when we relaunch the website in July. We're also going to be crowdfunding for season 3, which is going to be based off the Russian spy investigations we've done. So we're also working as well to start trying to produce TV documentaries or film documentaries. We're actually working at the moment at setting up a production company, and we're hoping soon that we'll be able to start producing our first actual documentary feature that we're hoping will be broadcast quite widely on television internationally. So we're trying to kind of really take ourselves to the next level at the moment.
That's awesome. Eliot, really, thank you for your time.
There's no problem. Thanks for your time.